This is a truly magnificent Mamluk kilij. But what makes it truly special is not only can we trace its Mameluk history in Egypt, we can also trace its history of where it went after into the British Army, where it served through 3 generations of one family of officers in the Coldstream Guards. Hi, I'm Nick Thomas and welcome back to the Sword Studies series at the Academy of Historical Fencing. Today I'm going to be looking at this absolutely beautiful and truly astonishing Mameluke kilij. And this has just come to me briefly. It doesn't belong to me, but it's been sent to me by its new owner to make a few videos on before it goes off for professional restoration and into a collection. And I very rarely see a sword with this significant a provenance, a history that is so well documented and that we can also prove, and is specifically of interest to me, being as my core interest in swords from a historical perspective of collecting, of antique, of research, is Napoleonic period. And this one just has Napoleonic history in spades. There's a lot to say about this sword. Let's kind of just quickly go over what it is and then originally where it came from, because to be honest, every part of the history of this sword is truly fascinating. So this sword is a form of kilij, which is very famously a Turkic Ottoman type of sword, although used far more widely outside of just the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish peoples. And significantly, this one was owned by a Mameluke chief. So the Mamluks were a people in Egypt who were ethnically diverse, mostly non-Arab, mostly Turkic, Eastern and Southeastern European peoples from countries such as Georgia and Armenia. Initially, former mostly Christian slaves that were taken in and made into basically slave soldiers, converted to Islam, and then eventually became a kind of ruling elite in their own right. So they went from these, child soldier slaves up to a military elite and a kind of knightly class who eventually then ruled Egypt for a very long time. And when you get to the Napoleonic period, the Mamluks were kind of in their last years. The Mamluks really ended in 1811 with a slaughter that killed most of them. A small number escaped, including the original owner of this sword, funnily enough. The kilij blades don't have any fuller in, they're flat blades, and they very characteristically are pretty straight along much of their initial length, and then they curve in this last part to varying degrees depending on individual example and also period. They tended to get more curved over time. And so this blade is a very early blade. It's earlier than the rest of the hilt and scabbard. So this blade is probably a 17th century blade, very old type. And the hilt then probably made sometime in the late 18th century. So to go over an overview of this sword, it is a saber-like sword. In fact, in British English, we'd often call this a scimitar, which is not a very helpful term at all, to be honest. But nonetheless, it's in the English language. It's kind of relates to a family of basically foreign sabers, if you like. It includes all kinds of shamshirs and kilij and pulwars, tulwars, all sorts of different similar ish, at least in British eyes, sort of foreign curved single-handed blades. And this one would be called a kilij. So we have a blade of, I will measure it in a minute because I have all my instruments, but a medium length blade that is unfulled. It's not especially heavy, although it has so little hilt weight that the total weight of the sword is low, but because there's so little hilt weight, it has a very forward balance. It feels very, very choppy, if you like. The best thing I could compare it to, for those that are familiar with European swords, is something like a cavalry saber. Even though this is way lighter than most cavalry sabers, again, because it's not especially long and because there's not much hilt weight, but the handling characteristics are most like a Northern European cavalry saber, particularly of the late 18th and early 19th century, things like the 1796 light cavalry saber. So onto the hilt, we have the characteristic kind of cross-shaped guard, which is silver. In fact, all of the fittings on the scabbard are also silver, which is rather nice. The grip of horn, this ring, which I would imagine was added later, probably for use with a sword knot, and certainly where it's depicted later on with the British officer wearing this exact sword, it seems to be with a sword knot. It could potentially be a chain because we can't quite tell, but I think it's more likely to be a sword knot. And so what we have here is a truly magnificent example of a kilij, and this was probably one of the finest quality kilij in Europe at the time. Absolutely fantastic. The blade itself may well be Damascus or Wootz steel, which is that kind of pattern welding method, but you're not going to see it until basically it is re-etched. It needs to go to a professional and they need to go over it and see if they can bring out that pattern into the blade, which it probably will, to be honest. So that's a kind of overview to the sword, but not only is this, as I said, this is a magnificent sword, but really what makes it special and sets it apart from most is not just the fact that it's really, really high quality and just beautiful to handle, is the history that we've got with it. So this sword was given in 1801 to a British officer by Ibrahim Bey. Now, Ibrahim Bey was a Mameluke chief, so Bey is essentially a Turkic title meaning chief, or closest that we have in English. And Ibrahim Bey was one of the two Mamluk leaders of his day, and as a result, him and the other Mameluke Bey were the ones that fought Napoleon in 1798 at the Battle of the Pyramids, where admittedly they lost. But then in 1801, the British then went into Egypt and threw the French out. And at that time, in 1801, Ibrahim Bey gave his sword to an officer in the Coldstream Guards. This is a painting of Ibrahim Bey in 1804. He was a Mamluk. He was taken from Georgia, it's believed, when he was a boy, and became a Mamluk, trained as a Mamluk soldier, and rose through the ranks to become one of the two Mamluk leaders in Egypt. So he rose a long way. And in 1801, he gave this sword to a Coldstream Guards officer, which was Hilton Jolliffe, the colonel of the 1st Battalion of Coldstream Guards, who gave it on to General Cal of the Coldstream Guards, who then gave it on to his son, who's John Stepney Cal. And that's where, to be honest, the history from certainly British swords gets really interesting, because so far, okay, we've got its Mamluk history, which is pretty cool, at least who gave the sword away, a very important figure in the Mamluk society. But then it goes into this chain through the Coldstream Guards. And now I said it initially went through Hilton Jolliffe, who was an interesting character in himself in his day, and he became an MP, for example, Member of Parliament later on. But yes, it went on to Cal, and he gave it to his son. And that is where, certainly from my perspective, because my Napoleonic interest really kicks in. So, this sword has battle honours, or at least campaign honours, all the way across the scabbard. And that is truly fascinating. And so it tells us where this sword was through each of the different officers and generations that had it. So it tells us that it came from Ibrahim Bey, that it went through Hilton Jolliffe, that it went on to General Cal, and that it went on to then I would say, the most interesting British owner, which is John Stepney Cal. And he then had it through the Peninsula campaign, and in fact it says on the sword with all the dates where it went through: Portugal, Spain, Belgium, Holland, and back into France, and it goes through its history. Now, this is an officer who served as a lieutenant and then a captain in the Coldstream Guards, so he was, a frontline infantry officer in, the Coldstream Guards, which is a very famous regiment. In fact, it's the oldest continuously serving regular infantry regiment in the British Army, having served from 1650, so steeped in history. In fact, they weren't called the Coldstream Guards at this time. They were called the Coldstream Regiment or the Coldstream Regiment of Foot Guards. So the change in name to Coldstream Guards came in 1855. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And therefore, this sword, in fact, it says on the scabbard that this sword served this officer, this particular John Stepney Cal, through these campaigns. And that officer fought at battles such as Fuentes do Ouro, the siege at Ciudad Rodrigo, the Battle of Salamanca, Battle of Vitoria, some of the most famous battles of the Peninsula campaign, which I think is truly fascinating. Now, did he carry this sword on the battlefield? Well, that is hard to say. So these Mamluk swords, they gained a real sort of following among British and also French officers as well after the campaign in Egypt, and certain British officers and even certain British regiments started using kilij and sometimes also shamshir inspired blades, and to varying degrees the hilts as well. So this form of hilt that you see on kilij and shamshirs became common with high-ranking officers within the British Army, especially high-ranking cavalry officers and generals and that kind of thing, and later did become the official pattern for generals in 1831. And so, yes, it became a real fashion statement to use one of these types of swords, whether it followed the blade or the hilt or both. And it was very commonly used, as I said, a status symbol and as a dress sword. Now, were many of them used necessarily as fighting swords? Well, the dress swords of cavalrymen were, generally speaking, not just designed as dress, but also dismounted service swords. So when you see a sword described as a cavalry dress sword in say, the Napoleonic period, it isn't necessarily just for show, just for sort of, fancy parties, although it is used for that purpose. It is also for their dismounted service, so when they're, not actually working in cavalry duties on horseback. Incidentally, they may still, of course, be on a horse at times because an officer does travel by horse. They may have their dismounted service sword even when they're riding. It's just not as they're serving as part of the cavalry. So, anyway, that's mostly about cavalry, okay? This is a sword that we know was taken by an infantry officer into the Peninsula campaign. Was it used as his dress sword or was it used as his fighting sword? Well, by regulation, it absolutely shouldn't have been his fighting sword. Absolutely not. At the same time, this officer, his father was a general, not only an officer in the regiment. So what an officer can do in terms of his own equipment is really at the mercy of whoever's in charge of the regiment. And when your father is the general, I would say there's a fair bit of leniency that's going to be allowed. So would this have been carried as the battlefield sword of this particular officer? Well, to be honest, it's entirely possible. Stranger things have happened. You will read accounts of officers taking on captured swords, trophy swords, even necessity just taking swords out of field hospitals where they've lost theirs or it's been destroyed and they just take whatever they can get. So there are circumstances where British officers didn't have the sword that you might expect, or the sword that they should carry by regulation. So is it possible that he carried this as his fighting sword? Well, it's entirely possible. It's a trophy sword of a campaign where the Coldstream Guards were involved, and it was given to an officer, essentially in battle, if you like. As far as the Coldstream Guards are concerned, it probably wasn't actually in battle, but we won't know. And therefore, it's entirely possible, I would say, that he carried it, despite the fact that it doesn't fit the regulations. Now, when you see inscriptions on swords or scabbards that say they were owned by this so-and-so officer or they were captured at this so-and-such battle, you do need to take it with a pinch of salt because, unfortunately, unscrupulous owners and dealers over time have added such details to try and boost the value of their items. And so you do have to take some of these things with a grain of salt. But whilst I was researching this sword, I went looking for portraits of the officers who had owned this sword, and I did find a few, including the one of the Napoleonic officer that I mentioned most, the Stepney Cal, who was a lieutenant and a captain in that campaign. And there is a portrait that I found of him, or at least I found a copy of it in an auction catalogue. So I don't have the colour version at the moment, although I'm still tracking that down. But I found a high quality black and white photo of it in an auction catalogue when it sold back in the 1990s. And as it happens, that painting was painted likely based on his uniform in the 1830s, probably at the start of 1830. And as it happens, it shows that he was pictured or painted with this exact sword. And if you look at that image, you can see down to every single fine detail of the sword hilt and the scabbard that this is the sword that he had in that painting, which was painted close to 200 years ago. And so that goes a long way to prove the provenance of this sword, which is really awesome. So after that officer, the Stepney Cal, who served as a lieutenant and captain in the Coldstream Guards, had this sword. He then gave it to his son in 1843, which is also mentioned on the sword here, that he presented it to his son, who also then served in the Coldstream Guards, and unfortunately was killed in battle at the Battle of Inkerman in 1854, during quite a famous action that has a number of plaques and statues related to. It's quite a famous incident for the Coldstream Guards in the British Army. And that takes us to the end of the ownership of this sword. So what we have here is, as I've said, a truly magnificent Mamluk sword. So you will find kilij in museums, and you'll find them in personal collections, and you'll be able to find them at auction. But it's very rare to be able to say that it's definitely a Mamluk sword, which is really quite fascinating, particularly when the Mamluk swords had such an influence on the British Army of the time. And then it's super rare to be able to have one with such a fantastic history associated with it and provenance. Now I'm going to go into a breakdown with weights, measurements, balance, everything, so that if you're into sword handling, sword making, the stats, anything, then you're going to find it pretty interesting to see this sword. I'm going to break it down in fine detail, give you a good idea of how this sword is in terms of handling. As I've said before, it doesn't have a lot of hilt weight and it doesn't have a lot of total mass, but the blade is fairly thick, and so it does cut with a lot of authority, shall we say. So the blade is 76 centimeters long, or approximately 30 inches. That is, curiously enough, a very, very common length for British Napoleonic sabres for the infantry officers. It's a really, really common length to find, so pretty standard for British swords. So I'm now going to take a measurement of the curvature. Now I've talked a lot about curvature of especially Napoleonic era British swords. There was a fashion trend for British swords to go kind of excessively curved to the level that they weren't even necessarily great fighting swords. No, not all did that, but there was a trend for it, and part of that trend was based out of copying kilij and shamshirs, but the British just took it way too far at times, not always. But whilst shamshirs can often be highly curved, the kilij tends to be less so, and particularly as it doesn't tend to curve until the last kind of third of the blade. And so the curvature is not as extreme as some other swords, and it doesn't happen until much later. And so the curvature on this blade is, maximum curvature is 5.5 centimeters. So that is roughly equivalent to a British light cavalry sabre. So it's a good amount of curve, but it's just not remotely extreme. So you're not going to have a problem getting this directly on line to targets. You're not going to have a problem thrusting with it. Again, there's this myth that goes around that reasonably well curved swords can't thrust, which is just absolutely nonsense. Curved swords could absolutely thrust, and they can actually be quite sneaky in doing so. And in fact, these type of swords were known for being used to use this curvature to thrust around opponents' blades and shields and all kinds of things. So it's not remotely an extreme curvature. It's a fair amount, but nothing extreme. If we now look at the weight, it is 644 grams. So, that is really light. When I look at British Napoleonic swords, an infantry sabre is typically around 700 up to about 800 grams. They can occasionally be lower, but not normally. And so even by the kind of small, light British Napoleonic infantry sabres, as they often are, this is even light in comparison to those. But again, it just doesn't have much hilt weight. Now, there's the British swords, they have a big lion back strap, or even the plain versions. The guards are a bit more substantial, the grips tend to be a little bit longer, and so overall the British swords just have a little bit more mass in the hilt, usually. So, yeah, a light sword. But, and this is what I'm going to talk about with the handling characteristics, it may be light, but it does not remotely feel light in the hand. It's nimble, sure, but the balance is 17.5 centimeters. So that balance is pretty much in line with typical light cavalry sabres of the late 18th and early 19th century. That's what I was saying, is that very few infantry sabres balance quite that far forward. So it has the handling characteristics kind of a light cavalry sabre, except the fact that the total weight is a good bit lower. And so it feels like it cuts with a lot of authority, but overall weight is quite low. And because it's not that long, you're not fighting a big long length of blade. So it feels still quite nimble whilst having a lot of power and authority in the cut. Now let's talk about the profile. So this is an iconically typical kilij profile, particularly of the earlier blades. So as the kilij went on, what tended to happen is that they added a T-spine construction to the back of the blade for about the first 2/3 of the blade approximately, which is similar to a pipe-back construction on some British swords that came in the early 19th century. And in fact, the idea probably came from the kilij, even though the actual shape of the profile is kind of T-shaped on the kilij later on, whereas the British is an actual roundish pipe. So it's not quite identical, but the concept is very, very similar. But this one doesn't have it because this is an earlier blade, probably 17th century. And those kind of later kilij, they tend to adopt the spine. The flared section at the tip tends to get a lot wider, and sometimes the blade lengths get a bit shorter as well. So this is typical of an earlier kilij. So you'll see that the blade profile does not change drastically along its first 2/3 of its length, or even 3/4 of its length, and then towards the tip in what we call the foible, it flares out. Now, not a huge amount. It's not a really broad, wide flared tip, so it adds a bit of mass, but not a huge amount. And also, as is typical, this flared section, which we will call a yeoman, is completely sharpened. Now, the front edge of this sword is currently still really sharp. You could test cut with this easily, whereas the back edge clearly was sharpened in the past, but has not been for a very long time. That's, I would say, in line with British doctrine, is that of all the hundreds, maybe even thousands now, of British swords I've handled of the late 18th and early 19th century, it's quite, or very rare, to find that the back edge section is sharpened on them, even though some cultures did it as standard and used this back edge for striking an awful lot. And frankly, even in Northern Europe, the back edge was used in some swords and some sources. So I think this clearly was very sharp on this back edge, but in its British usage and British service, they've no longer sharpened that back edge and they've only sharpened the front. So let's now look at the profile taper. 3.3 centimeters down at the shoulder. At the halfway point of the blade, it is 2.8 centimeters. Just before the yeoman is 2.7 centimeters. Then at the start of the yeoman, it is increased to 3 centimeters. At the midpoint of the yeoman, or the foible section, it is still 3 centimeters, and then it tapers off from there. And so there's not a lot to be said about the profile taper, as it's kind of self-explanatory, as not a lot of profile taper for all of this, and then a small amount of flare outs for the yeoman section in the foible there. So now let's look at the distal taper. So the distal taper is the thickness of the blade and how it changes down the length. So British swords of this period typically, almost always, have what we would call a complex distal taper. So distal taper, generally speaking, you could just say it's, for example, 6 millimeters thick here down to, let's say, 2 there, which is kind of typical profile of many blades of the time. But that would suggest an even taper, whereas most British swords have a complex distal taper where they start really, really thick at, let's say, 8 or 9 millimeter is common, and then they immediately bottleneck down, and then they start the normal distal taper. So it might be 8 or 9 millimeters there, it'll drop immediately down to about 4 or 5, straight after the start of the blade, and then it'll go into a relatively normal distal taper from there. This blade doesn't have any complex distal taper. Okay, so it's not actually hugely thick. So I'm going to use my kind of clawed caliper here so I can get into the angles. So the blade is 5.5 millimeters thick at the shoulder, which is Not hugely thick, to be honest. There are British blades that are that thick, but remember it's unfullered, so there's a bit more metal in it than some British blades, because most British blades around this time were fullered. At the halfway point, the blade goes to 2.3 millimeters. Just before the Yeoman, it is down. Well, it's actually increased, or actually, it's at 2.4. Okay, and in the middle of the Yeoman, it is still 2 millimeters. And so this is a blade that does not have a huge amount of distal taper, especially as it doesn't have complex. But it's still, 5.5 down to 2, and it's not a massively wide blade. But also, I need to mention at this point that that thickness is not across the whole blade. So that's the thickness at its widest point. But the shape of this is kind of a convex curve, so that's the Yeoman or foible sort of section. This is the Yeoman, the whole thing is the foible, this whole end of the blade. This foible is not one thickness with an edge ground onto it. It is essentially a lenticular construction, so it's got a convex curve, okay, on both sides. And so whilst in the middle it might be, just over 2 mil, the moment you start moving towards the edge, I've only gone a few millimeters across towards the back edge, and it's down to 1.6, and then 1.5, and as I get closer to the edge, it's down to 1 millimeter, and it's still going down to 0.7, 0.6, 0.5, and goes onto an edge, and the same the other way. So that is not 2 millimeters of flat steel with an edge ground on back and front. It is 2 millimeters with a convex curve going to the front edge and going to the back edge, tapering all the way to 0.5 millimeter at the edges. So you might think having a blade this wide that is 2 millimeters thick has a lot of mass in it, but that's not, a wide, fully 2 millimeter thick piece of steel. So it's not as heavy as it might necessarily sound. So let's now look at the hilt components. So the grip length, let's include everything, including what we'll call the pommel, this section here. It is 10 centimeters from the cross of the guard to the end of the pommel. The space inside the grip here, from the edge of the silver guard into this nook here, so the maximum space that you have available is 8 centimeters, which is not very much at all. It is compact. And now a lot of antique swords are shorter and have less space in the grips and guards than a lot of reproduction swords do today. Especially if you watch movies, for example, they tend to oversize the grips, oversize the hilts. A great many antiques, not all, a great many antique original swords are a lot smaller on the grip than modern swords. And the things like a kilij and a shamshir are at some of the most extreme ends. So they have extremely small grips. So you can't, be doing a thumbs up saber grip, for example, with this kind of sword, is that you're forced into a hammer grip type position. There is really not a lot of room to do anything else. It's very, very compact. And again, I have medium-sized hands, and it's just a perfect fit for wielding it in what we'd call a hammer grip. The crossguard is 13.3 centimeters wide. The langets, that's these parts here that point up towards the blade and go over the scabbard and into the grip. The langets are 7.3 millimeters long. The guard width, so that's to the langet is 2.5 centimeters. The grip, so in profile it's quite a thin grip, but it's actually quite fat if we look at it there. So the grip is at the top, the highest point, 2.4 millimeters. It keeps tapering down to about 2.2 in the middle. It goes to its thinnest point, 2 centimeters down in this nook here, and the widest point, including this pommel type section at the bottom, is 5 centimeters. But if we look at the depth, it is 2.2 centimeters at the top. As we work down, it gets to 2.4, and at the base 2.5 centimeters, so there's a little bit of flare out as we go towards the base. Now it's nicely rounded off, so it doesn't feel like a really kind of square chunky guard, even though there are some hard lines here, but it's quite rounded off on the flat surfaces here. So I mentioned earlier on in the video that the Coldstream Guards were not called the Coldstream Guards when this sword was given, and in fact when it was carried and owned by, in fact, any of its owners, from the original Mamluk owner through the initial Coldstream Guard officer that had it, and then the 3 generations of the Cals. So Murray Cal, the last Cal to have had this sword, was killed in Inkerman in 1854. The Coldstream Guards changed their name to the Coldstream Guards in 1855, and that's obviously just 1 year after the last Cal was killed, whereas the Cal who would serve through the Peninsula campaign, he lived into the 1870s, and so I would imagine this inscription, so the inscription on the blade, actually calls them both the Coldstream Regiment, which was commonly what they were called at the time, and it also refers to them as the Coldstream Guards. So I would imagine that most, if not all, of the inscription that's been put onto this scabbard was done in that kind of 1855 or just after period, and probably kind of in memory to his son. Let's talk a bit more about the scabbard, because I've not said a lot about this. Now obviously we have all of the inscriptions here which tell us so much about the sword's history, which is absolutely fascinating. But I have shown a lot, and I've talked a lot about that already, so let's talk about the rest of it. So the scabbard is completely rigid. Now this is unusual for a British sword. Now the scabbard almost certainly was given with the sword. Everything fits, all the fittings match. So this was likely as it was given by Ibrahim Bey to the Coldstream Guard officer. And it's rigid, which is unusual for a British sword that has leather on it. So British scabbards of the time do roughly follow this form. They do tend to have metal at the base, at the chap, basically the bit that protects the tip of the sword, and they usually have metal near the top, which is obviously where the sword enters the scabbard, and they usually do have 2-ring suspension systems just like this. So overall this is not so unusual for a British scabbard, except for the fact that it's rigid and that these metal fittings are just so huge and so long in length, which is decadent or extravagant, and some cavalry officers did do that, but it's rare. And the rigidity, okay, so most British swords of this period that have leather and metal fittings, well, they're usually soft. They have no core to make them rigid, so this is a completely rigid scabbard. It feels like a metal scabbard, and the reason for that is it has a wooden core. So it has quite a thick wooden core to it, which is then wrapped in the leather and fitted with the silver fittings, which is quite nice. It makes it a really robust, tough scabbard, which is excellent, especially when you use it from horseback. So often infantry officers that did spend a lot of time on horseback went to metal scabbards for the simple reason that they're so much tougher. It's once you start using or wearing a sword on horseback, the scabbards take an absolute beating, and as a result the sword can potentially get damaged within it as well. Now, unusually, this is something you don't see on British swords. It has a cut-out section, so this is very common for kilij type swords, is they'll have a cut-out section near the top so that the scabbard can stay relatively thin and attractive, I would say, without being bulky, but still the blade can actually get out of its scabbard, particularly with the flared yeoman section. So that's quite nice. So the sword actually can drop into the scabbard, okay, and then run its length before it goes straight. So you have this cut out gap at the back of the scabbard. Another thing that makes this sword truly fascinating for the Napoleonic period and for British sword history is the influence that it had. Now, I talked about the fact that from the Egyptian campaign on, so in 1801 for the British, blade types and to a certain degree hilt types of kilij and shamshir type swords started to influence British officers' swords. Now this was mostly the case in cavalry officers and light infantry officers and rifle officers. And I do have here a sword that was the direct result of a British regiment being in Egypt, encountering the kilij, and then essentially copying it to make their own regimental officer's sword. So this sword is not a one-off by any means. It's a rare sword because it's a Royal Welsh Fusiliers officer's sword. It is a rare piece, but nonetheless it is their regimental officer's type. And if you compare it to a kilij, as I've done here, so this kilij we know was given by a Mameluke chief to the British army, or to a British officer. And this is a British officer's sword from just after that period. This was a British officer's sword made probably between 1801 and about 1810. And it follows the exact form of a kilij. Now, this has been sharpened at the back edge so many times that the yeoman section has worn down, which again I did mention is rare. It's really unusual for a British soldier or officer to sharpen that back edge. So not only did they copy the blade shape, they actually did keep sharpening that back edge to either copy or actually make use of the back edge, which is really quite fascinating. And the hilt features overall do borrow a lot from the kilij. This big bulbous pommel section, the langet shapes, there's so much taken from it. So this is in essence a British or Welsh kilij. And the Welsh Fusiliers were not the only regiment to use kilij-inspired or Shamshir-inspired swords by any means. And so what we have here is an original kilij from the Mameluks in Egypt and a British officer's sword from a regiment, because the Royal Welsh Fusiliers served in that campaign in 1801 in Egypt, and then copied it and made their own sword that is basically a British-made kilij. And to me that is pretty fascinating. So we've got the original and what came of it. So I've waffled on about this sword, its history and its owners for a very long time. So in conclusion, what can we say about this sword? Well, it is a beautifully made kilij. It was definitely Mamluk owned. It was owned by a very famous, noteworthy Mamluk and one of the last kind of notable Mamluks in their history. It was given to the Coldstream Guards and owned over time by 4 different Coldstream Guards officers. It was carried through the Peninsula campaign. As the Peninsula campaign owner, in fact, did then take part in the 100-day campaign, which is the lead up to Waterloo, and he fought at Quatre Bras before coming down with dysentery, so he missed the Battle of Waterloo, but he did fight at Quatre Bras. So this sword, it says, in fact, that it served through those campaigns. Did it get used as a dress piece by the officer, or did it get carried as his fighting sword? I don't think we're ever going to know. But I think there's a good chance, considering it is a good fighting sword, that it's been sharpened many times over, and that it's a trophy sword. I think there's a good chance that it was carried at least some, if not a lot of the time, on campaign and in battle, which is really quite fascinating. So there you have it, an absolutely beautiful Mamluk kilij that saw some fascinating history, especially with the British Army, and then also the influence that it had on British swords in that period. So although this sword does not belong to me, it was kindly loaned to me by its new owner, where it will be going soon, which is Alfredo Vasquez, and he will be sending it on to a professional restorer to make it look the best it can possibly look and preserve it for many generations to come. So I'm very thankful to Alfredo for sending me this sword. It'll shortly be going on to him if I don't make a few more videos involving this sword soon, but it's fantastic to have seen it. It's an amazing piece of Mamluk history, of British Napoleonic Peninsula War history. So absolutely awesome. Thanks for sending it in, and I will surely make some more videos of it. And incidentally, if anybody else wants to send in some swords with some great history that I can show on this channel and take to the viewership, please do so. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already.